Most of this framework elective is going to focus on the impact portion, because I think that's obviously the most important part, and also the easiest part to kind of mess up. But I'll start by kind of going through how we can conceptualize what framework is, and then kind of the interpretation level. I'll also make sure to talk a little bit about the topical version, because I think that is a pretty important tool that is going out of vogue right now, and it makes me very sad that people don't seem to want to have a good topical version or even anymore. So when we read a framework argument and we suggest that the affirmative needs to defend a plan, or that the negative should not be burdened with the rejoinder of negating a non-topical affirmative, we are presenting a model of debates. Okay, we are presenting a model of debate. And when I say we're presenting a model of debate, what I mean to say is that we are suggesting a heuristic for how debates themselves should look. Okay, we are presenting a heuristic for how debates themselves should look. So it is about the particular debate that you're in, but it's also about more than just that particular debate. And instead, it's about how we think debate itself as an activity should function. Okay, this distinction is meaningful, partly because it defines how your impact work kind of occurs, but it also matters in terms of thinking about the affirmative's responses. Okay, so when we're talking about framework, we're suggesting a kind of model for how debate should work. You will want to define all of the important words in the resolution. At the very least, that needs to include the terms United States federal government, because that's the part that the team who is not reading a plan is going to violate. There are kind of distinctions, I think, between affirmatives that do not talk about the topic at all, affirmatives that are reading a negative to the topic while they are affirmative, and then teams who would consider themselves topical, except they don't defend the United States federal government. All of that is to say that while the interpretation level tends to be the least important part of framework, it does still matter. And so it is important that you are able to read cards defining the keywords in the resolution and actually demonstrate that the affirmative does not meet those words. Okay. It is becoming more common that at least at the college level, high school level, not as is kind of hit or miss still, but Wake Forest has kind of invited a lot of K teams to think differently about how they're answering framework, and has developed kind of a different approach towards answering it, such that they have a bunch of counter interpretations and will say, actually, we think we are topical, and or we have a better model of how debate should function that still provides limits and ground and allows you to access all of your kinds of impacts. All of that is to say that the interpretation does matter, and you should be willing to define the keywords in the resolution. Again, US of G is the part that they're still going to violate, obviously, so you should be able to win a violation, but you got to have these kinds of things. Like I said, we're kind of glossing over all that stuff pretty quickly because the focus of this is going to be about the impact level and topical version. So to me, there's really only two impacts to framework that make any sense. The first one is limits. I think this is the impact. Limits. We may also decide to call this fairness, but there's some baggage associated with the word fairness that we sometimes want to avoid, such that it's easier to just call your argument limits. I think this has to be an impact. I think limits has to be an impact, because if debate is unlimited, if it is a conversation or it's a situation where anyone can kind of talk about whatever they want to, then debate itself as an activity collapses. Okay, debate itself as an activity collapses, which is to say that what makes debate? What makes it unique and valuable and different than going to a class or reading a book or having conversations or watching some really cool YouTube videos from professors online explaining their theories? What makes debate different is the fact that there is a controversy and that we are able to engage about that particular controversy in a way that is well prepared. Otherwise, debate becomes a conversation, right? Conversations are still meaningful, right? We still learn a lot from those things. They matter in a lot of different ways, but it's not the same thing, right? We can get that kind of education. We can have those kinds of conversations elsewhere, right? If limits don't matter, then why do we do this activity? Right? Why do we decide to be negative? Why wouldn't we just be affirmative every single debate? I don't really think there's an answer to that question. Or to the extent that there is an answer to that question, right, that debate is used for other things as well, like community building, a site of revolution, et cetera, et cetera. All of those other alternative answers of how we might use debate rely upon a competitive framing or understanding of how this activity operates, such that there needs to be a role of the negative. And in the world where the affirmative has not defended the resolution, what the negative is supposed to do, or what the negative is, how the negative is expected to respond, or what research and argument preparation the negative has developed is just entirely thrown out the window. Okay, so debate itself is not debate. If we allow, or I guess in the world where there is a model of debate that is not revolving around the affirmative defending a hypothetical implementation of the resolution and the negative negating that in some way. A separate point, but I think is also important and is kind of related, is that what the judge is supposed to do is entirely kind of thrown up in the air or thrown out the window, whatever that saying is, in the world where the affirmative is not defending an instance of the resolution. Which is to say that the standard whereby a judge comes to determine, yes, the affirmative has done the better debating, no, the negative has done the better debating, right? Or the affirmative has met their alternative role of the ballot, the negative has met their alternative role of the ballot, et cetera. The way that the judge gets to that conclusion is entirely different in a world where the debate is not grounded around the affirmative defending an instance of the resolution and the negative negating that, such that while many judges are able to figure this out on the fly, many judges also are not, and are then forced to render decisions that are not as coherent or that miss parts of what has occurred. Okay. All of that is to say that judging becomes difficult because the goalpost the goalpost, the requirement, expectation for what a win is changed. It is much like it is not predictable for the negative, it is not predictable for the judge. Which means that debate itself, how do I word this? It's another instance of how debate becomes not debate. Okay, so limits have to be an impact, because otherwise, what is this thing that we are doing? Okay, so if that's kind of the terminal impact level, I think that there are a couple ways we can go about the internal link level, right? So how do we get to being able to say that this is what happens when the affirmative is not defending a topical plan? I think there's kind of two pieces that are really important here. First, first is the argument that nothing really links. Okay, nothing really links. So oftentimes affirmatives will defend particular truth claims that are pretty much impossible to negate, right? X violence is real, X violence is bad, X thing should be done about that violence. When the affirmative does not have a stasis point that is predictably grounded within the resolution, i.e. the negative does not know what their strategy is going to be against that thing that the affirmative thinks should be done to resolve that violence, then it becomes pretty much very difficult, if not sometimes impossible, to figure out how to say that that strategy is bad, which then oftentimes means that the negative has to run to extremes in response. And those extremes are not great. We'll return to what that looks like in a second. Right, but if the affirmative has made a lot of truth claims about how the world works, kind of hard to say that's wrong. You want to make this as specific as you possibly can, right? So contextualize to this affirmative, right? Describe what arguments you lose, why it matters that you do not have the ability to read those arguments. Okay, what counterplans, disads, critiques, etc. do you not get to read, and why? And why is it a bad thing that you are not able to read those things? Okay, and there can be multiple reasons why it is a bad thing that you are not able to read those things, right? Part of this, again, goes into negative research, your ability to predictably prepare for the affirmative, right? If you've done a bunch of research on the IPR topic and decided that the core controversy is patents good, bad, copyrights good, bad, trademarks good, bad, which it almost certainly is the kind of the core controversy, and you cannot say that in response to the affirmative, right, then it demonstrates your argument, your impact about limits, right? Debate is not functioning as debate. Most teams will list some kinds of ground. They'll either list some ground you have, or they'll say it's not our job to tell you what ground you have. For the first one, if they are listing certain ground you have, right, everyone says you get the cap K, right, or you get, you know, some extreme structuralist critique against the affirmative. That ground is probably not very good ground for two reasons. One, it is concessionary, which is to say that they have decided in this particular instance that they have, you know, granted you as the negative the ability to read that argument. Right? If you were to read the cap K against the affirmative, they would obviously attempt to figure out no link and permutation strategies. They're not just going to like grant you the link argument. Two is that depending on the ground that they list, that ground may actually be pretty much zero, depending on who you are, who they are, who your judge is, the context of what is happening here. Right? Whenever I've been in these instances and I'm debating like a non-topical Wilderson affirmative, right? And they're like, you should read Afro-optimism against us. And like, I probably shouldn't read Afro-optimism against you as a white person who does not, have that kind of social location and or those experiences. Sometimes they'll grant you concessionary ground that just like doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? So they might say, you actually do get your disad, we'll just kind of give it to you. It's fine. You can read it against us. I was in a debate one time who said that the judge should vote aft to create queer communities that embrace toxicity. And then I asked in cross-ex, I was like, hey, what can we say against this? And they were like, you can totally just read your econ disad against us. It's fine. Right. So the debate suddenly turned into the AF creates queer communities that embrace toxicity, which I guess collapses the economy, question mark, question mark, question mark. We've all just kind of decided that's how it is for the sake of we can have this debate. Like, that's dumb. It's just like, that's stupid. And then sometimes, on the kind of opposite spectrum of this, the affirmative team will say, it's not our job to tell you what arguments you should read. You should be able to, you can figure it out on your own. In which case you're just like, well, that's kind of our point, because you didn't defend an instance of the resolution, so we actually couldn't figure it out on our own, because it's not predictable, it's not grounded in the thing that we came here to debate. So actually, no, we cannot figure it out on our own, because there are too many things in the world and too many things to research. You could spend an entire lifetime researching about any particular topic and never actually know everything, let alone any possible affirmative. I think another component of this, like, we don't have things that link to you piece that's important, is that you should remind the judge that you need offense in order to win a debate. Right? You have to be able to generate an opportunity cost to the AF, or else you're not going to win. Right? You can certainly stand up and say that, the affirmative does not solve X big structural impact that exists in the world, right? Like you can probably think of some like alt cause kind of argument against any affirmative, right? So you probably could think on the fly something to say against the F, but that thing is defense and is not a reason you're going to win. Okay, so we got to have offense. So that's the first kind of part of how your internal link to your impact of like, here's all of the ways that we could not have been ready to debate for this. That's my kind of like nothing links category. The other category is the part 2 of this is the case list, right? So it is, if framework is a model or a heuristic for how debates should operate, then there are other possible affirmatives that are justified under their interpretation that are way worse for debate. I would put this argument, this like case list kind of thing, as the response to their counter interpretation. Right, because the point of an interpretation, counter interpretation, is to say that it's twofold. It's to say that we have a good understanding of how debate should work, but any non-topical team worth their salt is also going to say that their counter interpretation, at least to some extent, resolves your limits offense. Right, so you should prove that their counter interpretation, in fact, does not resolve your limits offense. And one of the ways you can do that is by saying, okay, here's how this counter interpretation results in all of these other possible affirmatives that are also not debatable. Okay, does anyone have any questions so far? Yeah. Counter interpretation only RF is topical is insane. Because that is the most arbitrary thing that anyone could say. still makes debate impossible because it solves none of your offense. It still makes debate impossible because it's not grounded in the resolution. And it, in fact, probably makes your limits impact worse because every team could just stand up and say counter interp only RF. And so it actually shifts the goalposts in every single debate. Admittedly, if they're thinking of framework as a heuristic, then they're like, oh, this is how the whole season of debate should look. In which case you're just like that. I mean, it's still terrible. We should not have a whole season of debates where we're only debating your one half. Yeah.
What's the best answers to arguments that are like disclosure solves or like Cheetah proves that like in-depth debates over critical firmness can happen, or i.e. like teams can have adequate ground?
Yeah. Disclosure does not solve. Subpoint A is that it still requires us to do an insane amount of research about something that we were not expected to do a whole bunch of research on. Subpoint B is that when the, how do I word this? When the advocacy is not grounded within the resolution, it becomes very easy for that advocacy to change, or the explanation of what that advocacy is doing to change from debate to debate in ways that are still incredibly unpredictable. The like KVK teams do figure it out, you know, CETA finals proves can't have in-depth debates. Like, obviously we can't have in-depth debates. Like that is literally physically possible, right? Our argument is not like people don't ever disagree with each other in critical theory. The argument is that our ability to predictably prepare and know what do we need to read, how do we need to read it, in what sense is that used in a debate, is unpredictable. Okay, so like it is theoretically possible that we could luck into a strategy that makes a ton of sense, right? But we should not have to, because there are so many things. This is also, by the way, why I think limits is the impact, is because if your impact is just like a big, broad education, you know, if we're not in depth, we're not really learning things kind of argument, I think that argument is pretty persuasive. It's just like, yeah, but we do learn things. Here's a bunch of debates where we have. Yeah.
What about the argument that like other teams, I mean, this is sort of what Arnaud was saying, like other teams win consistently, not going for framework, going for like other non-framework strategies against chaos. Like, I think that might absorb all the predictability stuff, because they're like, these teams who do like KVK or whatever else, like win consistently, meaning it's not a predictability problem. Because they're not, like you said, you use the language of like locking into their strat. It's like this ex-college team wins on KVK all the time. Obviously, they're not locked into their strat. They know what they're doing against chaos without having like needing framework to win.
That is still a problem of predictability, because it has worked for those teams insofar as they have figured that out against these particular apps. Agreed.
Okay.
But what if they debate a team who's like new app and reads the K on the app? What are you going to do?
Okay.
Right. That's still a problem of predictability.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A lot of like K apps have like impact turns to like iterative debate over like X given issue, and they'll try using that to like impact turn a form of debate under framework. So it's like, sure, like limits, you might be right about limits, but under your form of debate, it would be like less educational. How would you like recommend delineating this limits impact from just education model?
Two thoughts. One is that debate is first and foremost a game. It is a whole bunch of other things in a whole bunch of other ways, right? Debate is a place for us to build community. It's a place for us to find friends. Debate is why I am who I am. It's why I went to grad school. It's why I read the things I do. But above all else, debate is a game. And at the end of the day, that is the only thing that is consistent across every debate that you will ever partake in, is that there is a winner and a loser. There is a judge. We follow speech times. We present arguments. And we try to negate against each other. Okay. That's why at the end of the day, debate is a game, is because that's the only thing that's actually consistent. If that is true, then limits have to be distinct from education in that the game itself does not function anymore. Second thought, and I'll get into this a little bit more in a moment, is that limits should turn and shape how their education kinds of arguments function. And yeah, I'll get into that in just a moment. Okay, so let's get into that. So like I said, I think there are really two impacts. The first one is limits, kind of talked about that. The second one is not a big, broad education argument, but rather a particular specific topic education argument. Which is to say that we should incentivize a model of debate in which we learn about intellectual property rights in each of the three topic areas. Okay, and there are three components of this. First is that the AF incentivizes a model of debate that sidesteps a discussion of the topic. Right? If we can all stand up and read, the same 5 to 10 pieces of evidence and call it an affirmative on any topic, and we just retag it so we say the word IPR in the top, then we're not really debating about the topic. Second is that topic education has to matter, right? Intellectual property rights and the regimes that are created do have effects in our and other people's everyday lives. And they affect us in very different ways, depending on the particular policies that have been implemented and that are being possibly implemented. Okay, so an AF that says green patents are good is very, very different than the copyrights for graffiti AF, which is very, very different than the military AF. Okay, these are very different claims about how the world works and how it should work. In the world where our approach to IPR policy is all IPR is structurally violent, we should not have to defend the topic, we start to paper over those nuances and those distinctions, and then start to understand those policies as creating the same effects. Okay, which is bad, both because those different policies have different effects on people. The lived experiences and realities that they institute are different from each other. And to get back to, sorry, what is your name? Shaman. So did I say that? Shaman? Yeah. Okay. To get back to Shaman's question, shapes or demonstrates that the education that the other team has suggested we should institute in debate or learn from in debate is wrong and not very nuanced, and therefore not very helpful within the context of intellectual property rights. So the topic education impact, we should learn about IPR. We've got first that the AF incentivizes a model of debate. That means we don't really talk about the topic. Second is that we should talk about the topic. Third is that topic education turns the case. Right? Oftentimes, the non-topical team will suggest that they defend a world of KVK debates or Rev v. Rev debates, short for it's either revolution or revolutionary action, whatever. Revolution, how do we revolt against bad things that are existing in the world right now? The problem is that these kind of vague, abstract debates are not really all that helpful for the instigating the social changes that the affirmative would like to create. Okay, these are not very often, there are exceptions to this, not very often how these debates occur in the real world, because when academics write and they're like, I disagree with this other person, it's very rare that they're just like, this person is wrong. Instead, they have an additive approach where they say, this person got this thing right, or I thought this is really interesting, or this was really helpful that they said this. It made me think about this other thing that I think can also help us think about X, or also help us instigate Y. Okay, so because debate is combative, because there's an affirmative and the negative is supposed to say, no, you are wrong. When we get into debates about rev v rev, theory v theory, et cetera, we are bastardizing literatures. We are not doing what most, again, there are certainly exceptions to this. There are instances where academics write against each other and say, actually, this person is totally wrong. But most of the time, not how people are actually writing about things. And it is almost never where people will pit big, broad theories against each other, right? People don't write Afro-pessimism versus queer theory, right? Or people don't write, I don't know, feminism against capitalism. Because when people write articles and they've done all of their research and said, here's what I think should happen, or here's how I understand the world to be working, they have gradations, they have nuances, they have examples, and they engage in those nuances and are generally additive. And what's especially bad about this kind of approach in debate is that competition means we are forced to say radical extremes, right? If I want to prove that my queer theory K is competitive with their Afro-optimism affirmative, I have to say the opposite of the AF, because otherwise I know that they're going to go for the permutation. Which means I'm forced to say the most extreme, least nuanced version of the argument that I am introducing. Yes.
Is that potentially a reason what, like, an answer to the perm against, like, the K that you read on the net?
Maybe. I don't know. So, like, I'll use queer theory as an example because it's what I know the most, right? In debate, we love to read radical queer pessimism, right? We've got a bunch of Edelman stuff. We've got a bunch of Stanley stuff. Okay. It's very rare that the more optimistic queer theorists will look at those scholars, that scholarship, and say, no, this is wrong, throw it out. We entirely disagree with this. Instead, they're additive. They're like, this was really interesting. A lot of people, so like Edelman is the perfect example of this because Edelman's No Future was, I mean, huge, radically different than anything that people had said before. And a whole bunch of people wrote in response where they were like, I kind of disagree with this. I do kind of think that, you know, we should be more optimistic, orient ourselves towards the future. But also Edelman had some good points and we should really engage with what he said here. And this is important. And it made me think about this thing in this way. And that mattered for these reasons. Right? People in academia aren't debating each other. Which again goes back to my first point of what is debate. It doesn't function in the world where we're not talking about a result or an previously agreed upon topic. Last part I'll say here about the turns the case thing is that we should debate different methods to resolve the AF's impacts. Okay, and in the world where the AF is not required to defend a tangible method, becomes really difficult. Again, this is kind of the permutation problem, right? Is things will morph and change in ways that are hard to keep up with and prepare for. So to me, these are the best two impacts. limits, and then a topic education argument. I think it's pretty easy to, or pretty straightforward, I guess is a better word, to say, here's how this interacts with the affirmatives impacts, and here's how it complicates their ability to make the argument they want to say. Does anyone have any questions so far? Cool. Last thing I want to talk about is the topical version. Topical version of the AF, I think, is like, if you can win it, it's definitely game over, because there should be no reason you lose, because it proves they could have been topical and also solved their offense. I also think that the TVA in and of itself can be offense, depending on the model that the affirmative has suggested should be defended. And we'll talk about that in a second, but my biggest pet peeve when I judge a team going for framework is when they introduce a topical version and then immediately are just like, don't worry, it's not a counter plan. It doesn't actually have to solve anything. It just means we can maybe have a debate about their thing. Like, it's okay, whatever. Like that big ol' L. Because you have then said, here's a topical version. Actually, never mind. Don't worry about this topical version, right? It's a waste of time. Okay, so instead, I would recommend that you think of your topical version as akin to, it is obviously not actually, but it is similar to the introduction of a counterplan, where you claim that you have said, here's something else we can do to solve all of your arguments and avoid the net benefit of the limits DA or your topic education DA. And I think if you start from that premise of this is basically a counter plan, then it will force you to think more and then as a result, better explain your topical version. Because dear God, I can't tell you the amount of times I've watched a framework debate where someone's been like, here's a topical version, and then like just immediately been like, we don't really think it actually does anything, just ignore it. Like, what's the point? Question?
What do you think about like doing it in the other direction? So like the 1 and C, there's framework also a counter advocacy that is like has a topical text and has an actual net benefit outside of framework. But then by the end of the debate, like perhaps you end up like just articulating it as a TVA, as in like a reasoning to put on topical.
I mean, you can. I think the problem with introducing it as an actual advocacy is the permutation probably resolves that, especially if you are correct that it solves. And so I think it's better to just, I think it's better to think of it like a counterplan, but it not actually is a counterplan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Part of the app offense, do you think that topical version solves?
I think if you're good at it, it solves all of the app's offense. I mean, that's the point, right? Like, yeah. Couple of things you need to think about when you're developing a topical version. First is that the state can be good in some instances. Your argument is not a big, broad, the state is always good. But it's like, yes, the state can do some good things sometimes. And by the way, I don't know if this is actually, well, I know for at least one other kid at camp, because I had this conversation with them earlier, is like, yes, the state can do good things sometimes. Just 100%. The state can do good things sometimes. Turns out that the world is not so simple that we can just say X large institution is always already evil and never does anything good. That's just nonsense. We have tricked ourselves in debate into believing that that's not true. And this is such a low bar, okay? If their answer to the topical version is, but the state is evil, and you're like, okay, that is a large categorical statement about how the state operates. If I prove one counterexample to that, it negates the entire categorical approach there. So you're just saying it can do some good things sometimes. Obviously, the state also does a bunch of terrible things, duh. But that does not mean that it is not possible that it can do good things. Okay, so if we've started from that premise, it becomes easier then to say, here's the particular thing I think is very good that can resolve problems. And you should be willing to take that T version to a kind of radical extreme. Okay. So the best example I can think of is that on climate topics, this will probably pop up in college again this year because we've got another climate topic, is a pretty common topical version is to have the United States affirm its ecological debt. Okay, ecological debt is this theory that says because we in the Western world are like 95% responsible for climate change, it is our ethical obligation and duty to do anything and everything we can to both resolve that and in the act of resolving that, make the lives of people in the global south much easier. So the affirmation of ecological debt would mean immediate entire decarbonization, transition off of fossil fuels. It would immediately mean that we funnel billions of dollars into countries in the global south in order to develop infrastructure and build houses and things like that, right? Like it would radically change how the world works. Okay, the world would be so very different if the United States affirmed its ecological debt. And on most climate topics, that is a topical affirmative. Okay, and that action would be so radical that politics as we know it could not function. Politics would have to look and act and be different. Okay, so think in the kind of utopian direction. I admittedly have not thought a lot about what I think really good TDAs are on IPR yet. It's just this is a very complicated topic and I just haven't spent the time to really think that through. But because it is such a complicated topic and there are so many people who write about intellectual property rights, you can almost certainly find something. Yeah.
So this is something that I've seen once or twice before. So somebody read an app previously with a plan and then took the plan off and added one more card. Do you think that ethos wise, that in a debate versus somebody like that like the TBA should just be like a crush if they were reading it before and it like proves competitive incentives, you changed it because you weren't winning?
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay. If a team kicks their plan, they should just lose on face because they now no longer have a thing that the judge is voting half for.
Sorry, I meant like in a different round, they.
Oh, a different debate.
Like,
yeah, well,
almost all the same cards.
Maybe. I am less interested in proving intent. I don't think that we can really prove intent. And so it's not so much like you did this yourself because you decided competitive incentives, but rather that the both proves topical version and suggests that you know, there are ways that you can be limited and still have your app as well. What's your name again? I'm sorry. Alina.
You sort of answered this already, but like, what do you think about the argument on the TBA that's like any solving the deficit to the TBA is like net ground? That's good.
I think that's fine as like a last resort response, right? Like,
but you want, like, you think that it'd be better if the TBA just solved all that?
I think you want to explain how and why your TVA solves, because if you're too quick to jump to the this is just neg ground, then it becomes very easy for the judge to think less this TVA maybe lets this debate happen, and instead think this TVA does not allow them to have their app anymore. I will also add, by the way, and then I'll get to your question, Arnav, is that if you can explain why the topical version solves the AF, in fact, better than the affirmative does, then it is offense against the affirmative because they have instigated or suggested a model of debate that forgoes a world in which the AF reads that as the affirmative. So they have made it such that we cannot defend that as the action in debate. And therefore, the topical version is not just solving the AF's offense, but a reason in and of itself they should lose. That is beneficial. Or sorry, that only becomes possible in a world where you are actually walking me through why your topical version solves all of their things. Yeah, Arnav, what's up?
So one common thing I've seen is like teams now start reading like, criticisms of like the resolutions like requirement.
Yeah,
Or whatever.
whatever.
Do you think like the TBA can be leveraged there, or is that like not really a good place for the TBA?
Yeah, I think it possibly can. If your topical version radically reshapes how politics operates, then perhaps it also suggests that we think about fiat differently in ways that are more beneficial. I will also add that K's of fiat are insane to me because the affirmative is also fiating something, right? When they say that X thing should occur and they read an advocacy, they are imagining a world in which that thing has happened and therefore helps to resolve a problem. That is all that fiat is. Okay, so when they're like, fiat is bad or like cruel optimism or whatever, all this stuff, it's just like not even a little persuasive if you have an answer to it. Like I've certainly voted on fiat criticisms, but only when the other team just like it just fumbles and just doesn't understand that fiat is just a tool that we use in debate to imagine a world where something has happened, and then we debate about the effects of it. Fiat is so we can debate the effects rather than the likelihood of something occurring. Because if we were stuck in a world where we were just debating the likelihood of something occurring, then debate would be pretty much useless. I saw a hand over here and then your hand.
Which side debate, do you think you need to win the, like the TBA, like the state, do good things sometimes?
Maybe. I am less interested in switch side debate as its own impact. I'm more interested in do it on the neg, solving their offense, because it suggests that they can read their criticism in other debates. There's not necessarily a reason they need to read this particular argument in every single round. I think the problem with switch side debate as an impact is that it's kind of non-falsifiable. I don't really know how it, addresses dogma or, makes us better people or whatever kinds of things people talk about here. So I am maybe just not the person to ask about that. Yeah.
What do you think? I guess you kind of talked about this with Sterling before, but like, what do you think about arguments about like what the other team reads in other rounds? Like, you read framework or you read a plan in other rounds. Like, do you think that is a worthwhile thing to say, or is it just like not a good argument?
I mean, I think it demonstrates that there are instances in which they have agreed that the topic can be good or important to discuss. The problem is that it's very easy for the problem is that crosses into intent, and it's very easy for their team to be like, well, we know better now, right? We changed our mind. And it's just like, I'm not really up for challenging people's intent. I think that gets too much into weird moralistic authenticity testing that, it's like we don't really know each other like that. And your judge also certainly doesn't know you all like that, even if you're best friends with your opponents.
Okay.
So like it can work, right? It can be persuasive. I'm just generally, I think it crosses into some territory that can be concerning in debate. Yes.
It's just like another rehashing of the same question, but what if like they read topical acts normally and then panel dependent or judge dependent, they switch? Is that also an intent?
I think my answer is exactly what I just said. Yeah. Okay. Cool. That's what I got. Enjoy lunch.